and welcome to another episode of Latitude. And in this episode, we are going to look at Afghanistan, more specifically with New Delhi's evolving relationship with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. What are the options? And would the most recent attack on a Gurdwara in Afghanistan have a serious impact on how India decides to take its engagement further with Afghanistan and the Taliban regime? And what are India's options for the future? We have with us two well-informed and experienced hands, as always. On the show, we have Ambassador Vivek Katju, who's been an envoy in Afghanistan and has written extensively about the region and particularly about Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we have my friend, Captain Alok Bansal, formerly of the Indian Navy, author of many works, and now a celebrated scholar and a director at the India Foundation, who has been watching our neighborhood very carefully. So I'll start with you, Ambassador Katju, sir. India, in a way, it seems to be toying with a new relationship model, which deliberately and judiciously separates its engagement with the Taliban government and the Afghan people. So there is a desire to engage, but engage cautiously, but with a certain degree of optimism. At the same time, India has been continuing to supply the Afghan people many of their needs, including COVID-19 vaccines free, as well as 50,000 tons of wheat to the starving population in Afghanistan, many other things. You know it all too well, particularly because India's friendship quotient with the Afghan people has remained very high. So how does this all fit in with the concern that the minorities are in danger in Afghanistan, and could the Taliban-led government really assuage India's fears?
Look, I'll make the following submissions to you and through you to your viewers. First, this distinction between the Afghan people and the regime is really born out of the position that we took on the Taliban, on a stubborn refusal to talk to them when the whole world was talking to them and engaged. Today, geopolitically and strategically, we have simply no option but to deal with the de facto rulers of Afghanistan. But since we pursued a policy, we are trying to sort of find a soft landing to a new policy, a policy of engaging the Taliban through drawing this distinction between the people and the de facto authority. Now, this doesn't mean that we or anyone else is going to recognize the Afghan government anytime soon. There are certain criteria that the world has spelled out. Until the Taliban fulfill that criteria, I think diplomatic recognition is not going to be there. Having said that, engagement will be there, because you can't do things for the Afghan people without doing business with the de facto rulers in Afghanistan. This is diplomacy 101. And that is why I think the government, even though it was delayed, took a very good step when it sent the Joint Secretary PIA, JP Singh, to meet with the Taliban leadership. And I do believe that the government was moving actively in the direction of establishing a permanent presence in Afghanistan, and that policy decision perhaps had been taken. But the attack on the Gurudwara naturally meant that a certain caution had to be exercised, because we need to know how the land lies. Now, as far as the attack is concerned, and that brings me to the minority question, we all know the Taliban ideology. We know how their theology, but strategic interests are strategic interests. And while we need to put pressure on the Taliban on the minorities issues, until now, they don't seem to have actively followed the path of the Mullah Umar's Taliban had pursued. Yet this attack was claimed by ISIS and or ISKP, the Islamic State of Khorasan province, and they said that the attack was on as a retaliation for certain remarks that had been made on the Prophet. Now, that is how the land lies. I personally think that the sooner we establish a presence in Afghanistan on the ground, the better. Naturally, security concerns about our personnel are paramount, but I do think that the Taliban have given assurances, and on their part, they would do all that they can.
Point seen, sir. Point seen, and in fact, they've apparently given assurances that they would provide a certain amount of security support to New Delhi if we reopen our embassy there. But Captain Bansal, two quick points. One is, it is clearly emerged now over a period of time that the Taliban is not exactly a proxy of the ISI, though the ISI helped them to get into power. And the second is that people are drawing a fine line between how the ISIS-KP operates in Afghanistan and how the Taliban looks at minorities in Afghanistan. Your view?
Any regime in Afghanistan is bound to have differences with the regime in Pakistan. And there is a Indian government which feels that we can harness these differences and we need to approach the Taliban government because that will help us to accentuate these differences. They also feel that I think there is a need to negotiate with Taliban because we might be left behind because there are other countries which are already present there. My personal take is, yes, there is no doubt that Taliban and Pakistan will have differences. And very often we don't look at theological and ideological underpinnings of Taliban. Consequently, countries like Pakistan and China, which have helped the Taliban to come to power, have not been able to influence Taliban to target those organizations which are ideologically aligned with Taliban but are targeting countries like China and Pakistan, to quote Uyghur militants or TTP. They have at best been able to relocate them or to facilitate talks with them as far as Pakistani government is concerned. So we must understand that irrespective of what we do, ideological issues will always pit us against Taliban, and Taliban's presence in Afghanistan provides some sort of a tacit support to all such jihadi outfits, not only in India but in the entire region. So to that extent, some conflict of interest will always be there with Taliban. There is no doubt that there is a huge goodwill amongst the masses as far as Afghanistan are concerned for us, and we need to do something for them. But we should in no way try to legitimize or support Taliban regime.
Okay.
Second thing is, just one more point which I wanted to say. This attack on Gurudwara, we need to understand. The Taliban was providing defense. The Taliban was providing security to Gurudwara. Despite that, the Islamic State managed to get through. And so any security that Taliban guarantees, you can never be sure that that will provide a foolproof security. Second thing, as far as I am concerned, as far as religious minorities are concerned, I think Taliban is willing to provide them security to the extent the state has the capacity to do so.
All right.
As far as Dhimmis are concerned, they are acceptable. But I think Taliban in times to come will find it very difficult to accommodate sectarian minorities, which their ideology will not accept.
Well, Captain Bansal has brought out some of the very important verticals within which hardline groups or hardline states operate. But Ambassador Katju, I want you to explain that is our desire to re-engage with Afghanistan led by Taliban pushed more by our civilizational ties with the Afghan people? You know them well, you've served there. Or is it pushed more by a desire not to be left out of the emerging narrative with many countries now establishing their relations in Kabul? Some had kept their missions there, Russia, Turkey, UAE, Iran, were already operating out of that. So what really is pushing us? Love for the people or being real?
Well, I hope it is being real. Civilizational ties are all very good. But let's not be carried away by this, by all this talk of civilizational ties. At the end of the day, nations have to protect, safeguard, and promote their strategic interests. States with common civilizational ties can be terribly inimical to each other. That is what history shows. But strategic interests have to be pursued and pursued relentlessly. Of course, we should have no illusions about the Taliban. But then we've dealt with Pakistan. And should we have illusions about the Pakistan state or what Pakistan has done to us and continues to do? So if we can engage with Pakistan, surely we can engage with the Taliban, knowing full well that the Taliban may have ideological and theological sympathies with Pakistani hardline groups, but that's in a separate category. The second point which I want to submit to you is that you would have heard that there's been this terrible earthquake, 6 degrees on the Richter in Paktika province. The epicenter was some 44 kilometers from Khost city. I, for one, feel very strongly that this is an opportunity for us to send our sort of disaster management teams. I believe that the death toll is 1,000 and it might climb more. So even as we speak, I would very much like to hope that the government is willing to undertake a large effort to offer assistance to the Afghan people.
Okay.
The Taliban and the other international agencies who will no doubt be acting.
Yes, that's an important humanitarian point. We need to go in for a break. We'll come back after a break to look at some of the other key issues regarding India's relationship with Kabul and Afghanistan as a whole. But that after a break. Welcome back. We are continuing to look at Afghanistan, what India's relations with Afghanistan, the government in power there of the Taliban should be, how India should respond to the needs of the Afghan people, and where does Pakistan come into the entire equation. Captain Bansal, you've written about this subject quite a bit, and I think you'll be able to enlighten us, certainly. Pakistan apparently has to worry about the apparent collaboration between Baluch nationalists and the TTP, and these groups are operating in consonance, I believe, with certain amount of support from across the Durand line in the KP province. And if skirmishes on the Durand line are going to be a common factor between Afghanistan and the Pakistani groups, who you may call Pakistani Taliban, then what is going to be the challenge for Islamabad on this subject?
See, there is no doubt that TTP has been operating from inside Afghanistan and targeting Pakistani targets. There are some reports about Baloch nationalists also using Afghanistan safe havens, though ideologically I don't find too much of congruence between Baloch nationalists and Taliban. There are significant Baloch pockets inside Afghanistan, especially in the southern part, and where there are a significant population which is sympathetic to the cause of Balochistan. And Baloch, now having taken a suicide bombing as a new weapon in their arsenal, have become extremely dangerous. As far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan has gone to the extent of bombing some of the TTP's strongholds inside Afghanistan, which incidentally was criticized by PTM leadership. Now, this is what I find. The PTM and TTP are ideologically opposed, but PTM opposed Pakistan's bombing of Afghan territory. So what is happening is that all sorts of anti-Pakistani groups are trying to get together. And Pakistan at this point of time, when it is facing an imminent economic catastrophe, is actually in a dilemma, because there is a political turbulence in Pakistan. Pakistan is a step away from default. there is a huge economic crisis. I think in the history of Pakistan, they have not come so close to default ever in their long history, though they have been seen a lot of economic crisis. But at this point of time, this sort of a congregation of opposition groups coming together poses a serious threat to Islamabad.
Okay. Master Katju sir, going back a bit to a point you made before break about the visit of Mr. J.P. Singh to Afghanistan and the assurances that was given to India by the Taliban regime, and including, I believe, Mullah Omar's son, that Afghanistan will not allow its soil for anyone to use that land against another country. And clearly, Pakistan's role was also brought up in the discussion, whether Pakistan could use that soil against India or Indian interests, and neither would they allow any Indian agenda to be furthered via Afghanistan, which has been Pakistan's concern. Your views?
Look, there is no doubt that Pakistan has fully supported the Taliban ever since its inception. But that does not mean that the Taliban's interests and Pakistani interests coincide in all respects. In fact, as Captain Bansal correctly noted, there necessarily must be differences between anyone in Kabul and anyone in Islamabad stroke Pindi. Now, I do believe that while we should not exaggerate these differences as of now, but the fact is that we have ample opportunities to work to promote our strategic interests in Afghanistan. And the Taliban, right from the beginning of coming into Kabul and before that, was signaling that to us again and again. And their people were saying, please don't take us to be Pakistani proxies. We have a certain dependence on them, but we are no one's slaves. And that is a streak which everyone historically knows about the Afghan character. As the old saying goes, you can rent an Afghan, you can't own him. I'm not saying this in any disparaging term. What it means is that the Afghan is always conscious of his interests. And he can be dependent, but it doesn't mean that he'll do your bit. He'll do the person on whom he is dependent is bidding all the time. So we've got to be conscious of these.
Point well made, sir. And Captain Balsan, last quick question, request a shorter answer, and that is that Mullah Omar's son, Mullah Yaqub, has suggested that they would like to send once again Afghan army personnel for training in India. In the past, India has trained Afghan cadets in the military academies. So now, how do you see that panning out? And is that a plot, as some people might say, to send in people with eyes and ears bigger than the picture presents?
I think the training would entail fresh recruits, fresh soldiers, fresh officers, and junior level who are not so ideologically committed to the Taliban ideology. And I think it would be worthwhile training them because they will be valuable assets. There may be one odd person who may have an agenda more than the training, but we can always be watchful. So if this sort of a proposal comes, we should accept it and consider it our involvement with the Afghan people rather than the Taliban regime, because we have seen that Afghan army and its troops very often join the force which emerged victorious in Afghanistan. Many of the previous regime soldiers, etc., have joined the Taliban regime after the change in government. So that sort of a thing might happen if there is a firm offer. But at the moment, it looks like an exploratory offer from Mullah Yaqub. And since he's pitted against Haqqani network, that may be an attempt by him to actually seek our support against the internal groupings which is aligned with ISI in Afghanistan.
Well, I'd just like to add a footnote to that to say that our support will only be diplomatic and not necessarily.
No, can I add just one sentence?
Quickly, sir, quickly.
One sentence. Look, there are contradictions between the Kandahar Taliban and the people from Paktika and Khost. However, we should not take this as a permanent truth.
Okay.
There are alliances too. So when Yaqub is saying this, and if I'm not wrong, Yaqub is the defense minister.
Yes.
We should take it as a responsible person making this offer.
Okay. So that was the last word to you. Thank you very much to both of you for your inputs. Let us see, because as I have watched over the years, situation in Afghanistan and our relationship with Afghanistan is always evolving. Thanks very much, and thanks for watching. Until our next episode. Goodbye.